All right, let's take a look at some Unix and Unix-like systems. There is actually some more important information in this than in the Windows section, because it has to do a lot with what we are seeing now, as opposed to what was happening then. So Unix is very old, and there's no operating system that exists that is popular. We'll throw that in there. That is not based off of it. So even Windows NT, right, they hired a Unix guy to do that. So 1969, the birth of the internet, 1969, the birth of Unix. And so you kind of see, well, what's the deal there? Why are those two, born at the same time? Well, okay, we're now looking at having a diversified system where you're not just locally tied into your equipment where you're at, but you can be tied into equipment that's hundreds, thousands of miles away. And do we have an operating system that can account for that? We need to add users. We need to do a lot of things, right? So Unix was kind of created with that in mind, and it is the oldest and most diverse. And Mac OS is built on Unix, meaning that when you write commands on a Mac, it's Unix commands. They're POSIX compliant, as a matter of fact, and they are very similar to Linux because Linux is basically a copy of Unix. So what happened is AT&T, Ma Bell back then, Bell Laboratories invented Unix, and then it kind of started to split. And what they understood at the time was, as this little piece of crap DOS, right? It's really not doing much. It's for a single user, was growing and growing. Unix was there as a multi-user, and it was really used on high-end powerful systems. And so a lot of companies could kind of see the writing on the wall that, hey, we need something other than just DOS. And so some machines started getting released with Unix. You would have been talking about people in education, not talking about your high school teacher or even me as an instructor. You'd be talking about people that are doing a bunch of research and science and all that. They'd be using Unix. So what happens is that AT&T at this point is going to buy this outright from the creators. And they said, you know what? We kind of designed this so that there would always be a research option. So we want to split it. You have to agree, AT&T, that you can go ahead and take this and start selling it and start improving it the way you want it to be. And this BSD, Berkeley Systems Distribution, will exist there available for anybody to use free of cost. And so that's what you got. You got BSD and then System 5, Release 4, and that's Linux is tied to that, or not tied to it really. So this book uses Linux for Unix examples because Linux is free and we can get that all over the place. And yeah, you can go get BSD as well. We'll get to that point in a minute. Linux runs everywhere, so no problem. And then some Linux versions provide you with a GUI, which most do, and that's done through this X window interface, and you're going to be using Fedora. So I want to jump ahead here. And so right there it is, Mac OS X, which is Mac OS now. So there's no more X in that. It's built on Darwin, which was open source, and they took it and nobody seemed to care. They weren't contributing, so they just closed it and they do their own thing now. But that's Mac OS. So it's nice to see that that's in there. So let's take a look. What happened at this time? It's so interesting to see what happened with Linux, and this happened around 1995. So Unix is there. BSD is there. You can go look at bsd.org, and there it is, Berkeley Systems Distribution. And it's out there for anybody to use. But the truth of the matter is that whoever was over the project, they didn't really respond super well. So basically, when you're saying I need to update the OS, again, we're talking about the kernel. The kernel will not do this. The kernel can't apply this. And so people that are using BSD are like, we should make these improvements. We should make these improvements. This is taking forever for that to happen. In the meantime, you end up with Linus Torvalds, and I'm going to pull up, actually, let's pull up bsd.org, and then we'll look at a different one. Right, here it is. You can see there's FreeBSD, Open Darwin, all that stuff. different offshoots of BSD. And then there's Minix. So Linus was in school. He basically had to, one of the things you do in computer science, if you go that route, which is programming, you go into the programming route. I don't mean programming like, oh, I'm going to go get a programming degree. I mean, you go into computer science in that programming degree. You basically, one of the assignments, I still believe that happens, is to build your own operating system so that you understand what an operating system needs to do and why it needs to do it, which is fantastic. That's what Minix is kind of there for. It's kind of there basically written at the university there in Amsterdam, so that any student could take it and deal with, how does this work? And there's no problems doing that. You weren't gonna, the law was not gonna come after you, basically. And so Linus that's what he's dealing with. But Minix at the time did something very particular. It had an abstraction layer that sat on top of the hardware so that Minix could run on anything. Any CPU you wanted it to, it could run on. Now, the reason that was important back then is because you had Intel, you had RISC processors made by NEC and IBM, and the idea of being tied to a processor for a lot of people in the industry was like, this is stupid, right? Let's just use the hardware that we want to. So this guy, Tannenbaum, who's the one that did this, he had that abstraction layer in there, meaning you could run it on anything. Well, back in that day in 95, most people don't realize that there was still heavy restrictions on exporting technology, which probably should have stayed in place with the problems we're dealing with now. You could not just send a computer out of the US. So let's say I bought a computer and it was a Pentium 2, and then I had a friend that worked at a different university. I sent that to them. That technically was not allowed. So I could get away with it. Nobody would ever find out, but that was not allowed. That was sending trade secrets. That was sending in stuff that other people couldn't do, right? Nobody else besides England and the US were making processors and this kind of technology. And so you just couldn't freely just distribute that stuff all over the world. And so what Linus had to deal with was really old technology. So in 95, you're starting to deal with Pentiums, which are like 4 times more powerful than the other systems at the time. And he's dealing with a 386, right? That's like 8 times less powerful. So to run Windows 95 on that, on a 386, no, you would have had to have a lot of money. So he wanted to make an operating system that would be nice and slim and trim, and anybody would be able to use it. And what he was concerned with was running it on Intel processors, which were x86 processors. That's what he wanted to run it on. And so he stripped out that layer. He created an operating system, and then his friend, who was running off of a Unix server, I'll just type this here, Linus, right there, on a Unix server. And that was done a lot. So he's running, he's getting on the internet and doing that kind of stuff through his ISP. And on the ISP, they give him a little folder. That was very common. You could save some stuff because you couldn't just do that. You couldn't go out on the internet and dump some stuff on Google Drive. That wasn't there. And so the creator of that, the administrator of that server, the installer of the server, that's what he would do. You just take your first 3 initials, put UX on the end of it. And that would kind of signify to people, right? If you're pulling something out of that directory, then that server is a Unix server, that kind of thing. So he dumps in basically what he needs to into his folder and just kind of opens it up for anybody and says, hey, why don't we improve this, guys? We'll do this under the GNU, the new license, which basically means go ahead and modify it how you want. You can even take it and make your own thing out of it, but you can't go and just start selling it. All right, it's got to remain free. And so that's where Linux was born. And because Linus was who he was, just Torvalds, I think it's Torvalds. I can't spell it too well. But he's got his own thing because he was who he was, at least then. And I don't know what he's like now. There's his there's this website. He basically would improve things very quickly. That's, I guess, the point I'm getting to. He was very receptive. Oh, that's a great change. Let's put it in. Oh, that's a great change. Let's put it in. So he created a little group that was very, very interested in this, and Linux just blew up. And that's why Linux still to this day, that, as I say, it's definitely used across the board for web servers. But this day, if you're talking about using it for other things, Europe is really into that. They are so into that, where we're kind of into it. We're not that into it, because for them, that became their operating system. Didn't matter if you're a Greek or English, Linux, right? Because you can put into that and do all this stuff. And it was this, you can get a one that'll run on an old piece of crap computer, and then you can get one that runs on the high powered stuff. Right? And actually see, there's Chrome OS. In any case, that's where Linux came from. And it really, really took off and became what it is because of who Linus was and the fact that he was just open to letting it change. Most of the utilities and things you see stolen from Unix, and a lot of that was created by IBM and AT&T, but it's hard to prosecute. So lots of people will just say, oh, well, I love Linux because it'll read any file system and it'll do anything. And it's like, yeah, that's because they're being illegal about what they're doing. You know, if you were the programmer of that, you'd want to be paid for that bit of code. As a matter of fact, they sued IBM, started to sue IBM because IBM they purchased two versions now. Fedora is the big one they own now. So they purchased all of Red Hat. But gosh, I can't remember what the version was many, many years ago. IBM realized we need to get in the Linux game, so we'll purchase this distribution. And at that point, then you're closing it, right? You can close it, which is pretty much what they did. They closed it off and they made it what they wanted. And they did that because they provide top to bottom computer systems, right? Everything for an organization. And so some people in the Linux community started to create a lawsuit. And then so IBM responded and said, well, if you're going to sue us for this, this is all the code that we found and all these different apps that you guys include in your distributions. And all of a sudden, the problem went away, right? Because Linux was stealing from Unix the day it was born. And they were ripping people's code off and not giving them credit. So there's all those things too that happen. So anyway, back then that's how Linux became what it became. And the next little thing is going to finish up Mac OS and where it came from, because Mac OS didn't just appear out of thin air.